When you start a beloved new action hack and slash IP, how do you follow it up? You take everything players already loved and make it bigger, better, and flashier. That is exactly what Santa Monica Studios did in 2007 with God of War 2, only 2 years after releasing the first title in the now legendary series. Due to the short development time, God of War 2 is much like the first game, and despite me being somewhat more harsh than most in my critique of that game, I think it was a very smart decision here. While it may be true that the PlayStation 3 was already released shortly before God of War 2, Santa Monica figured that the install base on the new system would be limited compared to the gargantuan amount of people still owning a PlayStation 2 at the time. And the fact that the first iteration of the PlayStation 3 was fully backwards compatible meant that it was a no-brainer to continue their new series on the older of the two systems. As a result, you have a game that looks similar, plays similar, and runs similar, but every aspect of God of War 2 has been improved and the series really feels like it found its identity here. Let's start with the story. Narratively, the sequel here picks up a short while after where the first game ends. With Kratos having become the new God of War, he has largely spurned the gods, and instead spent his time and energy growing his people and army of Sparta into his own loyal army. Zeus, being the asshole that he's kind of known to be, is not a big fan of this and sees Kratos and his army as a potential threat to all of Olympus. In classic Metroid fashion, having his powers all stripped away and having lost his loyal followers of Sparta, Kratos sets off on a genuinely epic journey to see the Sisters of Fate so he can change the events of the past and get revenge on Zeus. The story here is honestly probably the biggest upgrade of all of what makes God of War 2 better than the first title. In that review, I criticised a lack of cutscenes, story depth, and depth within Kratos himself, but God of War 2 does a much better job of giving the player exciting moments peppered throughout their journey. Cutscenes really feel important here and are well choreographed. When one happens, you know either some cool shit's about to go down, or some secret about the gods and their past is going to be revealed to you. Kratos himself is also a much more entertaining protagonist here, showing genuine emotion for other people to balance out his mostly anger-filled purpose. You're going to run into a lot more familiar faces and names from Greek mythology in God of War 2 compared to the first game. Turns out, there are a lot of people from back then that didn't much like the ending they got, and also want to change their fate. And it's always a fun time seeing someone you know from ancient mythology show up, only to fight them and in usual Kratos fashion, brutally murder them for your own ends. Speaking of fighting and killing, how is the combat in the sequel here? As far as the combat goes, if you've played the first game, you'll be in for a very familiar time since the combat is nearly identical between the two games. If you're a fan of this combat, then that can only come as good news, but if you're like me and prefer the more technical and complex entries in this genre than the button mashing on offer here in this series, then nothing here is going to make you change your mind. This could be a bit of a placebo effect here, but if anything, I'd say that God of War 2 maybe feels a tiny bit faster, more responsive, and more dynamic than the first game, and the grabs seem to connect with your intended enemy a bit more often here, which was a complaint I had with the first game. You'll still be fighting the same types of enemies, albeit with a few cool kinds added in here that are either welcome new additions or replacements of worse enemies in the first game. You'll be slinging your same combos and strats from before, but there is less of an emphasis on killing specific enemies in certain ways to acquire the resource you're after. The magic list on offer here might honestly somehow be both the biggest and smallest change in the combat present. Kratos has a new group of 4 magical skills on offer, which leaves you excited for potential later in the game, but will sadly deflate players once they realise that the new magics just operate in the exact same way as they did in the prior entry. The cost for these skills feels lower in God of War 2, and magic orbs are supplied regularly enough that the player feels encouraged to actually use the magic whenever possible, and not have to save it for an emergency. My absolute favourite addition to the combat isn't a mechanic itself, but the fact that there are so many more boss fights in here than the first game, and they're all of significantly higher quality and all fun. Your Rage of the Gods mechanic, which was this game's equivalent to the well-known Devil Trigger, has been replaced with a new mode called Rage of the Titans, which is, for all intents and purposes, the exact same mechanic. That's the big thing with God of War 2. Developed in such little time and reusing a lot of the first game's DNA, this game does a pretty decent job of making the player feel like things are new and different without actually being new and different. So how about the level design? Is that anything new and different? The answer to this is yes. I feel like the variety and quality of levels on offer here is a decent step up. Just within the first few hours, you're treated to ancient Greek cities, the skies themselves to battle in, snowy mountains, and even ruins overrun with vegetation and colour. It's not just the variety of colours and locations that make the levels fun, but also the way that Kratos traverses them. A brand new swinging mechanic and time stop are just some of the ways that God of War 2 improves both how you move around the level and how you interact with both the levels and puzzles. The puzzles are still plentiful, but never feel like an intrusion that they're ruining the pacing of the game. It's quite admirable that the pacing was managed to be kept intact, considering the fact that God of War 2 is much longer than the first game, clocking in with a time between 10 and 12 hours depending on how well you fight and how quickly you solve its many puzzles. Criticizing the graphics and the sound design feels pretty redundant here since this game borrows so much from the first game, but the better slew of locations on offer does make the game look prettier overall. The big improvement comes in with the soundtrack. In my review of God of War 1, I criticised the fact that every song sounded the same, and on a recent repeat playthrough I felt that again. But God of War 2 really improves in the track selection. The songs on offer vary from epic to tranquil, and there's enough variety that I wasn't going schizo from the same melody bouncing in my skull for hours on end. Now, before we move on to the finale, scroll down just a little there and hit that subscribe button for me so you can stay up to date on all things game reviews. Overall, I think God of War 2 does quite a good job of taking everything the first game did and improving on nearly every aspect. The combat is still something I find to feel quite shallow, and a lot of the more defensive enemies feel like a huge chore to fight. But I think that this game really stepped it up a notch in every other way, from traversal and movement, to level variety, and to soundtrack. I can absolutely say that God of War 2 is a great game, and if you're a fan of action games, or even just the newer God of War games, you should definitely get around to playing this one. Thanks to the improvements that Santa Monica Studios have made to this sequel, I'm happy to be giving God of War 2 a score of 8 out of 10. I've never played any of the entries in the series after this one, so I'm not gonna lie, I'm actually really excited for the fact that we're not far at all from my first ever playthrough of God of War 3. I'll see you guys in the next review. Thanks for watching, guys.